Hello my dear friends, you're on the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 28th of January of 2024. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first we're going to talk about Kharkiv direction. According to some Russian sources, as a result of clashes on these directions, the Russians managed to enter and to capture another city in this area, in Kharkiv area, to be more precise, in Vovchansk region. The Russian sources haven't provided us any updates regarding the title or destination or the area that the Russians captured, but if you remember a few days ago we were talking that as a result of reconnaissance and combat operation, the Russians established control over the small village Plutonovka. This village is located on the hill, and this is the very good and the best position for the Russian forces to control and to attack the Ukrainian forces in Vovchansk using artillery systems. For now we don't have more details, so let's move further. And now we are moving to Kupiansk direction. We have a lot of very interesting details from this territory. The Russians continue their offensive operation in Sinkovka. If you remember, the Ukrainians yesterday counterattacked the Russian forces in the forest. All those attacks were repelled by the Russians, and now the Russians, after they managed to discover the Ukrainian positions, started clearing operation in Sinkovka with FPV drones. And during the previous 24 hours, the Russians published significant number of videos of FPV drone strikes against the Ukrainian forces. Furthermore, before I start making this video, other sources reported that the Russians probably managed to enter and to establish control over the northern part of the village. Yet we haven't received even a single geolocated confirmation of this, but probably we're going to receive some during the upcoming night, and maybe the next morning, the next short update, we will discuss this in details. So, for example, on this video we can see how the Russians tracked another Ukrainian, let's say, supply car or evacuation machine, and as a result of strike, that machine was destroyed somewhere in the vicinity of Sinkovka. A little bit deeper to Первотравневая, the Russians published series of attacks with FPV drones, and significant number of artillery forces, tanks were destroyed as well. Now we are moving to Kislovka, Kotlarovka, to this territory. We have lots of very interesting updates and details. As you can see, I have adjusted the map. I have added fortifications and strongholds from this territory for better understanding of the situation. And as you know, according to the Russian sources, according to the Russians, managed to penetrate the Ukrainian defense belt in Tabaevka. Some sources are saying that the Russians captured the village by the name of Tabaevka. Other sources reported that the Russians entered Kotlarovka and that there are very heavy clashes in this direction. Other sources are saying that the Russians currently are moving in direction of Peshchane. Of course, a lot of talks, a lot of rumors, somebody speculating, somebody is telling the truth, and today together we will try to understand what exactly is happening on this direction. And to understand what exactly is happening here, it's better to understand the Ukrainian stronghold, let's say, areas. If you take a look at this map, you're going to see that we can say that there are three fortification areas. The first fortification area goes, let's say, from the northwest of Peshchane, this one, to Glushkovka. This is, as you can see, one big line of significant number of defense belts and strongholds. This is one of the most powerful and one of the most important defense belts in this area. The second defense belt is located between, let's say, somewhere in the fields, and there are at least 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 strongholds. These are 5 strongholds that are located, let's say, separate to each other. They don't have any connections with the mainland, with other front lines. It's just a strongholds among the field, with the purpose probably to control the situation, to slow down the Russians, and just to have some strongholds where the Ukrainians can, let's say, stay at night or something like this. And we have the third defense belt, and we are talking about the village by the name of Peshchane, this one. Village itself is like Solidar. This is a very long village, and if the Russians attack this territory, obviously the only one road they have is to attack something like this. And this is not a very good, let's say, way of attack, because the village is not so big, but you will be forced to bypass the entire village as a result of this offensive. Furthermore, we have few strongholds, at least 3 big strongholds to the south of the village and 1 big stronghold to the north of the village. So 3 stronghold belts. First one, the second one, and the third one. Now let's move to the situation on the ground and let's discuss once again details and updates we have. According to the Russians, they managed to establish control over Tabaevka, this village that located in the lowland in the vicinity along a very, let's say, small river in this area. Most of the mappers have already updated their map, including the pro-Ukrainian deep state map, and according to most of the sources, this territory was captured by the Russians. Also, the Russians are saying that the Russian forces managed not just establish control over Tabaevka, but to take under control the hills that located to the west of the village. So others, for example, Deep State shows just Tabaevka under Russian control, and Syriac map shows the same, like this as the Deep State, just Tabaevka itself. So this is the situation about this territory. When talking about Kislovka-Kotlarovka, the Russian sources are saying that during the previous night, the Ukrainians made a series of counterattacks trying to force the Russians to step back from this area, but the Russians repelled every single attack, and this morning the Russians renewed their offensive operation. Furthermore, according to some sources, the Russians managed to get as close as possible to Kotlarovka itself, and there are heavy clashes and assault operations inside of the village. So, according to some Russian sources, as a result of offensive operation, the Russians managed to bypass and to establish control over this territory. You know that I'm not sure about this piece of news, this piece of information, because to establish control over this territory, let's say to get Kotlarovka from the south, the Russians need to bypass this big stronghold, and by 28th of January we still haven't received even a single update that the Russians managed to bypass this territory. This is a very big stronghold, but everything is possible. When talking about the common situation in Kislovka-Kotlarovka, the Ukrainian sources are saying that Ukrainians currently try to retreat and to withdraw their positions, and they're trying to evacuate their soldiers from Kislovka-Kotlarovka in direction of intersection of the roads, intersection of the railways, and N26 road. As you can see, this is a very powerful stronghold. This area is secured and protected from the north, from the south. There is intersections of roads which also something like a barrier against any offensive operation. So the main Russian forces, Ukrainian forces, are withdrawing from Kislovka-Kotlarovka in this area. Now we are moving to the south, and as you can see, without any clashes, almost heavy clashes or fightings. Now we are moving to Peshana, and let's try to understand updates and talks about this area, because according to a lot of mappers and a lot of reports, the Russians are bypassed, let's say, Tabaevka, as Russians say, and are moving in the direction of Peshanovka with the purpose to capture the village. Furthermore, the Russians published geolocated videos, to be more precise, a series of geolocated videos, how they were fighting and attacking the Ukrainian forces in this area. And there are a lot of scenes. Some of them were geolocated, some of them haven't been geolocated yet, but when talking about those parts that were geolocated, we can say that the Russian presence was geolocated, was discovered in this area along this tree line, and the Russians were discovered and spotted in this area, which from this perspective, from the first sign, tell us that the Russians are moving something like this. Very likely that the Russians are moving something like this, but obviously the Russians are not going to storm these strongholds in front. So obviously this is going to be a suicide operation. Furthermore, Peshana is located on the hill. So as I understand, the Russians are moving in direction of Peshana with one purpose. They're trying to bypass Berestova, the village to the south of the main attack road from the north, and to half encircle this village. So this is the maneuvers that the Russians are trying to implement right now, to encircle Berestova and to cut connections between Peshana and Berestova as well. Furthermore, I expect within the next 24 hours the activation of Russian movements from Novosilovska, and this is like the main purpose, and this is the configuration of this offensive operation from the Russian side. First, to force the Ukrainians to step back from Kislovka-Kotlarovka to main defense belt in these intersections of road, to capture Tabaevka, and let's say to block the Ukrainians from the north, and to bypass Berestova from the north as well, and to storm Berestova from the east and southeast. Very unlikely the Russians are going to start storming operation of Peshana. Obviously this is a very powerful stronghold, and they need a lot of time to prepare the foothold to attack this territory with FPV drones and so on. But maybe the Russians have some information. Maybe the Ukrainians are very weak on this direction, because if we take a look at the defense belt, we see that if the Russians are able to bypass Peshchane, there are no more strongholds and fortifications in front of the Russian forces right until Oskol River and the first villages and cities along the river. I'm talking about Glushovka, Kolesnivka and Kruglakovka. So after Peshchanovka, the Russians can continue moving further without almost any resistance and any barriers from the Ukrainian side, when talking about the strongholds, trenches and fortifications. So maybe they will try to attack Peshchane. We'll see. Now we are moving to the south in direction of Liman area. Today we received significant number of details and updates. The Russian forces launched a full-scale offensive operation in direction of Terny. The Russians were attacking the Ukrainians using a lot of roads of attacks. The Russians were storming the Ukrainians through the fields in direction of this area. The Russians were trying to penetrate the Ukrainian defense belt using this road of attack. The Russians were trying to attack along this tree line in direction of the forest, and the Russians were trying to attack the Ukrainians something like this. And according to all these destinations, we see that the Russians were trying and were planning to enter this part of the forest. Let's say to enter this part of the forest and to dig in deeper. This part of the forest the Russians were trying to enter, and probably to improve their position somewhere in this area. So now let's move to geolocations. For example, on this video we can see how the Russians, the beginning of the storming process, the Ukrainians have redeployed the Leopard, second Leopard Model 2 along this tree line, and that were attacking the Russian forces from hidden position. But as a result of FPV drone strikes, probably that Leopard was damaged or even destroyed. A little bit to the south, the Russians were moving or trying to storm this area using significant number of armored vehicles. They were trying to bypass the fields. Probably some tanks or armored vehicles got on minefield and was destroyed, and we have geolocated confirmation of destroyed armored vehicle. But as you can see, there are signs of tracks and probably tanks, and furthermore armored vehicles continue offensive operation deep inside the Ukrainian positions. A little bit to the south we have another video how the Russians troopers were storming the Ukrainian trenches, and how they were entering this area, and the Ukrainians trying to slow down the Russians were bombing them with FPV drones. So as you can see, it's a very powerful full-scale attack. Obviously the Russians managed to achieve results. For now we still haven't received any geolocated proofs or confirmations of any results. We need more time to wait. Probably tomorrow we're gonna receive something. And before this full-scale offensive operation, the Russians published the videos of attacks against the Ukrainian forces. That was something like artillery preparation, FPV drone preparations. The Russians managed to suppress significant number of Ukrainian positions, destroyed a lot of ammo depots, warehouses, suppress Ukrainian artillery forces, destroy Ukrainian tanks, and after that they launched that full-scale operation. Now we are moving further to the south in direction of Sivers's direction. We have also some geolocations. After a very short operational pause, the Russians renewed their attempts to storm this area. Currently they are trying to clear this territory with significant number of FPV drone strikes, with Lancet strikes, with artillery strikes. There are no movements on the ground, but according to geolocation we see that first the Russians are trying to collapse this Ukrainian defense belt that located to the southwest of Sporne. This is very, let's say, big trouble for the Russians. They were storming this territory a few times in the past. All those attempts were repelled by the Russians, and now the Russians tried to implement the next another attempt, and if they can penetrate this defense belt, they will be able to attack Ukrainian positions in Sporne from behind and to collapse this territory. Also, the Russians attack Ukrainian artillery positions and tank positions inside of Razdolovka itself, and the main purpose of these attacks is to destroy the material side of Ukrainian forces, and after that the Russians probably will try to continue their offensive operation because Razdolovka is the next stage. It's a logical development of the situation with Vysole. If you remember, just the previous week the Russians got Vysole, and now obviously they will try to complete the story with Razdolovka and Sporny. So currently these are two priorities of the Russian army. And we have another video of Lancet strike in Zvanovka. Another artillery system of Ukrainian forces was discovered there, and as a result of Lancet strike, that artillery system was destroyed. And now we are moving further to the south in direction of Bakhmut, Artyomov's direction. We have lots of interesting updates from this territory as well. The Russians published few videos from this area and the Ukrainians as well. On this, for example, video, we can see how the Ukrainians were attacking the Russian forces with FPV drones, which confirms the Russian presence. And the most important is that the Russians, as a result of offensive operation, managed to establish complete control over the stronghold on the north east of Bogdanovka. Now we have 100% proofs of Russian presence in this area. Furthermore, the Russians continue attacking and bombing the Ukrainians in the central part of Bakhmut, which confirms that as of 28th of January, they still haven't managed to bypass the central part, and there are still a lot of job to do for further offensive operation. Also, the Russians publish FPV drone strikes between the main strongholds along the railways. Another few FPV drone strikes. The Ukrainians try to dig in deeper below the bridge. The Russians discovered the Ukrainians and attacked them, which also confirms that very likely this territory is in the gray zone, and we will adjust the map before the next video. Now we are moving to Popovo Forest. The Russians attacked this territory as well, and it's another series of videos of FPV drone strikes against the Ukrainian forces. The Russians still haven't started any offensive operation on the ground in direction of this forest. When talking about Ivanovska, the Russians reported that they continue storming operation, and that the Russians also launch full-scale ground operation inside of the village. And currently the Russians are trying to improve their positions in the village itself and to increase the foothold in the city. Very likely the next few days we're going to receive more updates about the Russian progress on this part of Ivanovska. So there are very heavy clashes, which is confirmed by both sides, either the Russians and the Ukrainians. Now we are moving to Avdiivka area. The Russian forces continue their offensive operation on the northern flank of Krasnogorovka, on the northern flank of Avdiivka, and the Russians are moving in direction of Novokalinova. On this video, for example, we can see how the Ukrainian tank discovered the Russian personnel carrier, empty personnel carrier abandoned by the Russians. The Russians managed to establish control over the railways somewhere in the trenches and the strongholds, and the Ukrainian tank it destroyed the Russian, let's say, vehicle and left this territory. We have the same video from another angle. This is the video, this is the same tank, but now we can see this from the first person view. The same story, the Ukrainians destroyed the Russian personnel carrier. That means that as a result of offensive operation during the previous days and hours, the Russians managed to get here, and very likely they managed to establish control over this territory. Now the Ukrainians are trying to counterattack the Russians and to force them to step back. Now we have the right, and we will adjust the map, and we will color this territory as the area under Russian control. And we saw the Ukrainian tank here, so this territory will be kept as the Ukrainian territory. When talking about southern direction, the clashes in this area continues. We have a lot of very interesting details about the current situation on the ground, and the most important one is that according to information we have, very likely that the Russians control not the territory you can see in front of your screens. For example, according to some Russians, the Russians just today or these days launched their offensive operation and managed to establish control over the stronghold by the name of Skatovataya. And this is very important because you know that during the previous stage of special military operation, during the previous clashes in Avdiivka, most of the mappers have updated their maps in this area based on the Russian appearance and Russian presence in the, let's say, in Соборная, Спортивная and Чернышевского streets, so in this area. So that's why most of the mappers have updated their maps in this area. But later we found out, and we got these details about the Russian pipe operation, and according to information we have and according to geolocations, very likely that, for example, this territory is probably in the gray zone or at least under Ukrainian control. And now there are very heavy clashes exactly for this territory. To be more precise, once again, the Russians just now established control over Skatovate, and they're trying to push further in direction of the forest, trying to force the Ukrainians to step back. During the previous 24 hours, the Ukrainians also conducted an offensive operation. On this video, for example, we can see few armored personnel carriers from the Ukrainian side that enter Saborная Street. They landed their infantry. As you can see, they managed to bypass significant distance. This is, for example, Tsarskaya Khota. We see the Ukrainian infantry landed in this area. The Ukrainians are trying to create a foothold. They are spreading their forces, trying not to get under counter fire, and so on. And some sources are saying that this is old video of 21st of January. Other Ukrainian sources are saying that this is a fresh and recent video. Very difficult to understand who is lying, who's telling the truth. But anyway, the video describes something like this. The Ukrainians entered Saborная Street. They bypassed this street, this area. Then they reached this line. They landed the infantry, and the infantry established control over Tsarskaya Khota. Then the Russians called for some reinforcement. Reinforcement arrived in this area, and the Russians managed to clear this territory from the Ukrainians and to force them to step back, or maybe they even captured significant number of them. Anyway, the clashes for this territory continues. Now we see that very likely that the Russians still haven't managed to establish 100% control over this territory, and the reason of that is the endless number of Ukrainian counterattacks. Every single day, the Ukrainians are sending more and more forces with the purpose to restore control over this territory. So the clashes for the south continues. Now we are moving to Pervomayskaya area. According to geolocations and the video we have, the Russians managed to establish complete control over this territory. We have already updated this map. Most of the mappers did this before, but just today we got the first geolocation. So very likely that this part of Pervomayskaya, southeastern, currently is under complete Russian control. When talking about Marinka and Novomikhailivka, South Donetsk direction, we don't have a lot of updates, just satellite picture of this area, which tell us that currently the main Russian focus, the main Russian artillery focus take place here, and we see that the Russians attack this territory with the purpose to penetrate the Ukrainian defense belt and to get operational space, and after this operational space they can half encircle Побeda, and this will ease the further Russian progress and further Russian movements in direction of the village. So we'll see what is going to be next, but obviously soon the Russians will make first attempts in this direction. We haven't received anything from Novomikhailivka, just few videos of FPV drone strikes against the Russian forces, which confirms their presence here. And now we are moving to South Donetsk direction. The Russians intensified their actions in this area. A few armored vehicles were destroyed and artillery systems with Lancet, and we see that every single day the Russians intensifying their activity, which means that very likely the Russians can start counter-offensive operation in this direction as well. For now, no changes on the ground, just like a significant number of destroyed vehicles and damaged positions of Ukrainian forces. Now we are moving to Robotina area. As we discussed, the Russians launched a full-scale ground operation in direction of the village. The Russians currently trying to storm this area from the southwest, something like this. They have already established control over a few tree lines, which confirms by different sources. Furthermore, we got the video on the ground how the Russian infantry was moving something like this, but that attack was repelled. And we have few FPV drone strikes inside of the village itself. So the situation develops not in Ukrainian favor, and very soon we're going to start receiving the video from inside of village itself. The Ukrainians, to slow down the Russians, were trying to attack them with FPV drones in the vicinity of Kopany, trying to slow them down, to destroy their personnel carriers, armored vehicles, and they were more or less effective. Now we are moving to Kherson direction. We have some updates from from this territory as well. The Russians continue bombing the Ukrainian positions along Dnipro River with FABs, and now we see that the Russians restore the level of bombings probably till the creation of Ukrainian foothold in Krynki, and they're bombing this territory heavily. Probably that means something. For now, I can't explain myself what is the purpose of such a heavy bombing. The only explanation, of course, the simplest, is that there are a significant number of Ukrainian infantry once again deployed along the Dnipro bank of the river, which probably means that Ukrainians still have some plans for the, let's say, Dnipro offensive operation or something like this, or they're just trying to keep forces to force the Russians to always keep reserves on this direction. And that's it for this video. Military Summary channel reminds to condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for your watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.